Alliance, Young Women for Planetary Health, and Women Leaders for Planetary Health. My name is Vildan Soguktas, founder of Young Women for Planetary Health. I'm the co-moderator for this event, and I'd also like to introduce my co-moderator, Shaikat. Shaikat, Bangladeshi social change advocate and human rights activist, has over 15 years of experience championing youth rights, gender equality, democratic participation, and community development. Recognized globally, he was youth advisor to UN Habitat, a global young leader by Women Deliver. He has been honored as a Bayer Scholar, Asia Young Leader for Democracy, and 2024 Young Global Changer Recoupling Award recipient. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the scientific research on the mental health toll of planetary crises, including climate change, air pollution, and biodiversity loss. Without a healthy planet, humanity has no future. Climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss are driving a global planetary health crisis, one that is not only environmental, but deeply psychological. From wildfires and floods to the silent spread of pollution and disease, the impacts are both immediate and lasting. These crises are tightly linked to human health, especially mental health, yet this connection is often overlooked. As youth confront rising temperatures, worsening air quality, and deepening social inequalities, they also face growing levels of anxiety, grief, and trauma. Young women and girls are particularly at risk, burdened by climate stressors, compounded by gender equality and limited access to critical resources. This session today will spotlight the mental health toll of environmental crises on youth, with a specific focus on young women and girls. Our globally recognized speakers will examine the psychological toll of environmental crises, including anxiety, trauma, depression, and displacement, and explore their long-term effects on young people's well-being.
To start off our event, first we're honored to introduce Dr. Mary Studer for the opening remarks. Mary Studer is an executive leader with more than 20 years of scientific and education program and operational experience, delivering results for mission-oriented nonprofit organizations and multi-institutional consortia working at the intersection of community development and environmental advocacy. Her career has focused on public accessibility and understanding of science through government and public policy positions, to scientific and education leadership for international citizen science projects, to engaging formal and informal educators and youth in biodiversity learning, using hands-on and online resources and tools. Dr. Studer has been with the Planetary Health Alliance since 2020. She holds a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, in environmental sciences and BA from Wheaton College in chemistry. Dr. Studer, I would now like to invite you to deliver your opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much. I am so honored to be here. I'm going to share my screen with some slides that I'll go through very quickly. And please let me know if if you're not seeing the proper screen with the full slide. Again, I am so honored to be here and really want to shout out to the organizers of this really important meeting to think about how global environmental change is impacting especially youth mental health and what we can do about it. And let me just get myself going here. And so I want to just take a moment to give a very broad overview, though I will say that Ms. Soguktas did a great job of this at the very beginning, explaining really what planetary health is. And in very brief, non-technical terms, and you might even want to close your eyes for this, to imagine that planetary health is about the health and well-being of humanity as it's situated within and impacted by planetary scale environmental change. And it's very much focused on safeguarding health on a rapidly changing planet. This discipline and social movement was formed and launched in 2015, so we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. And it really is a solutions-oriented discipline, but what I love about it is at the same time, in this Lancet Commission report, they really called for establishing a social movement to deal with this urgent challenge. And the planetary health community very much is, I would say, a community forged in urgency, And how do we provide the evidence base, find solution, and connect people's hearts and minds to create this transformative change that we really need across all sectors of society to course correct this moment we're in and create a livable future. And of course, the urgency is very real. The science is showing us, and our hearts and minds know this. It is a matter to be dealt with head on. That's exactly what we're seeing with our youth leaders, which is so much needed and where we need to go. Earth system science, such as this planetary boundaries work, is telling us that we're in one of the most destabilizing times in our species history. And this work has identified 9 environmental or dimensions of the Earth that interact in complex ways to ensure that we can have a stable environment, which is needed and necessary for humanity to thrive. We also know that 6 of those 9 boundaries have been transgressed. And all of these interrelated disruptions are also considered what we call threat multipliers. So increasing the frequency and magnitude of natural disasters that also very much exacerbate health and injustice issues. And now, if we move from just looking at the natural systems, which is into looking at the holistic framework of planetary health, we see that planetary health centers the human dimension in the center of this and well-being within these changes, and it provides the evidence to connect the dots between these environmental changes and all dimensions of human health and well-being. What we're seeing through the literature and the research that's being done is that ecological determinants of health are a fast-growing portion of the global burden of disease. So just like we have social justice, social determinants and economic determinants of health, we also have ecological determinants of health. And of course, mental health is what we'll be focusing on today and what the panel will be speaking about. And certainly there are direct relationships between destabilized Earth systems and mental health challenges. It's also a very costly situation. And the 2023 Annals of Global Health study found that mental health disorders due to climate pollution, environmental related causes could cost the global economy $47 billion annually. So what does this look like for mental health in youth? I'm really going to leave this up to the panel to describe this to you, since it's not my area of expertise. But what we do see are statistics that are coming out that are really, I don't know if they're frightening, they're very sobering. They're certainly something that we need to deal with in terms of how much the mental burden is being impacted, how much our youth and others' mental health is being impacted by environmental changes. And this is, of course, comes crystal clear, as we've just heard, when we listen to our Indigenous peoples and cousins and friends, when they remind us that the health of the land and peoples are synonymous. Nurturing relationships, social environments, and providing strong basis for health and overall well-being. So really what we do to our planet, we do to ourselves, and we really must take stock of this. So we're at this critical point in our own history, and we really need to reverse these trends where we see human health well-being declining as alongside ecological health declining. And what we really want is to create a world where all people thrive for generations to come. And that's going to be by protecting and regenerating Earth's natural systems. So in order to create this great transition to a way to create a livable future, we must rethink how we live on the planet. And some of what we need to do is think about those stories that we tell ourselves about our place in the world and our relationship to nature. And just one book that came to mind as I was thinking about this is Terry Tempest Williams' book from 2009, Finding Beauty in a Broken World. And it just has 2 great sort of theses or paradigms that I love to think about is, what does it mean to be human in this era of physical and spiritual fragmentation? And how do we construct a narrative of hopeful acts by taking that which is broken and creating something whole? And I think that's our work here. And thankfully, we do have wonderful groups and many pieces of science, stories, and solutions that are really addressing this challenge, whether it's our medical practitioners who can now prescribe Nature RX, getting people outside into the natural environment for health and wellness, whether it's stories through big programs like We Are the Possible that brings the arts and humanities and culture together, and also solutions such as Connecting Climate Minds, which is looking at how you take global research and move it into mental health action. And of course, I'd be remiss not to mention the work of the Planetary Health Alliance, which is a global organization that is focused on all of this and really encourages people to become involved and take action, because we know action is helpful for addressing some mental health challenges. And with that, I would very much like to thank you, and really looking forward to our esteemed panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suter. That was a wonderful explanation, description of planetary health, along with the connections to mental health. So thank you for that knowledge. I really appreciate you taking your time to being here with us today. So to start off our speakers, I'd just like to set the layout first. We'll have 2 rounds of questions. Each of our distinguished speakers will answer 1 question every round. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joshua Wortzel. Dr. Wortzel is an assistant professor adjunct in psychiatry at Yale University. He just completed his child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at Brown and has joined the psychiatry faculty at the Institute of Living and the Yale Department of Psychiatry. Clinically, he works with young adults in an intensive outpatient program, and 50% of his time is dedicated to research and advocacy. He's the chair of the American Psychiatric Association's Committee on Climate Change and Mental Health, and is co-chair of the New American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's Committee on Climate Change. He is a fellow of the Climate and Mental Health Committee of the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry think tank, and sits on the steering committee for the National Nonprofit Climate Psychiatry Alliance. So Dr. Wortzel, on this round, we want to learn from you overall about climate-related mental health as a bio-psycho-sociocultural issue as described in your research, and how children and youth are especially affected by this. First, could you take just a few minutes to describe what climate-related mental health as a bio-psycho-sociocultural issue means in everyday terms, and why it's important to view it as an urgent and growing concern?
Certainly, and thank you for that very beautiful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'll take one step back just to say this is this kind of mouthful of a term, biopsychosocial, formulation for mental health. What does that mean? It's an old term in psychiatry that basically acknowledges that there are multiple contributors to why people experience mental health symptoms. There are biological factors, whether they're genetic or sometimes exposures that they may have in utero. There are environmental factors that can impact the biology as well. There's the psychological piece, the trauma that people experience, or the types of ways they connect with their parents, their attachment. And then there's the social piece, which is kind of the people we get to meet along the way and the society in which we're placed that can shape us pretty traumatically or favorably. So when we think about climate change, we know that there are a mix of all of those factors that impact our mental health, whether it's heat and pollutants in the air that can directly impact our biology, to the psychological piece of feeling like governments are doing or aren't doing enough to try to support us, or similarly our relationships with our parents and how they may be able to feel like they're protective forces, or how we relate to them, to the social piece of our peers and our communities and how we feel like we're able to cope in the midst of this crisis. All of that is fundamental to how we think about climate change and mental health.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wortzel. To follow up, based on your findings, how are children and youth especially affected by these overlapping factors?
Certainly. So we know that with many things in mental health, children are a vulnerable group because there's so much going on. The brain is developing, the psychological constructs that are going to kind of give them the groundwork for their lives is established at that age. So when it comes to biology, we know that children are less able to regulate their temperature, and they're therefore more vulnerable to heat effects. We were conducting some research recently showing that young people are perhaps one of the most vulnerable groups to the effects of heat on suicide. We know that childhood exposure to air pollutants can affect the development of their brain and lead to increased rates of neurodevelopmental disorders and a variety of other conditions. And even little ripple effects of how, for example, atmospheric carbon dioxide changes plants' nutrient content can lead to nutritional deficiencies that have impacts on mental health. There are a number of ways psychologically that children are impacted. They feel very disempowered. They're dependent upon adults for their safety. And many young people feel like adults are not doing enough. And so there's this sense of distress and betrayal. It's been termed many things. Climate distress is a large umbrella term to try to capture this range of emotions that people have about climate change. It can affect many people's daily life and functioning. There have been studies that show that nearly half of young people across the world feel like it's affecting their daily life and functioning. And so one other element too is the natural disasters that can sweep through an area create a lot of trauma. And we know that childhood experiences of trauma can have more profound effects on mental health than other age groups. We call these adverse childhood experiences. So I could go on and on, but there are a number of ways in which children are a more vulnerable group. Let me know if you want me to say any more on about it too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wortzel. That was a wonderful description of how children and youth are especially affected by all of these different factors. I'd like to hand over to my co-moderator, Shaikat, to continue.
Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Wortzel. I mean, it's really fantastic that, learning from this perspective regarding children and their well-being and issues. Now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Lise van Susteren. Dr. Lise van Susteren is a general and forensic psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and an expert on physical and mental health effects of climate disruption. She is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral at George Washington University and co-founder of Climate Psychiatry Alliance. She is a frequent contributor on television, radio, and in the print media. Her book, Emotional Inflammation, Discover Your Triggers and Reclaim Your Equilibrium During Anxious Times, was published in 2020. Dr. van Susteren, in this round, we'd like to hear from you the mental health effects of different climate crises and how they can especially affect vulnerable population. Firstly, could you please expand on the mental health consequences of different climate crises, including extreme weather events, wildfires, violent floods, and summer heat waves, as well as chronic climate conditions such as drought? Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate everything that goes into putting something like this together. So I want to start off by saying that every physical impact, whether it's from our environment, the nature writ large, has an effect on our mental health. And our mental health has an effect on everything around us physically. So it's a two-way street. If you harm us physically, you harm us mentally. If you harm us mentally, you harm us physically. So vulnerable populations, of course, children, as Josh already pointed out, and oftentimes at the other end of the spectrum, as people age, they become more vulnerable. So there are the chronic conditions that are caused by climate disruption. And then there are the extreme weather events that you mentioned. And the vulnerable populations, of course, are going to be less able to respond to these challenges. And for a variety of reasons, which we can well imagine, Josh outlined what happens with kids. And I will note also that one of the things that we wanted to highlight here particularly, I believe, was the impact on women and young girls. And what we find is that in the United States, and I'm the co-author of 2 survey studies, 16,000 actually that Marie referred to, 16,000 here, 10,000 globally. We know that kids have an emotional response to what's happening. And as Josh said, it's essentially off the chart. But what is noteworthy is that in developing countries particularly, that's where you see the most suffering because there are the fewest safety nets. And of course, what, about 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day? There's no backup. So when you have an extreme weather event, a fire, a flood, some other storm, something like that, when you have an incident like that, the vulnerability skyrockets for people who, especially women, typically have many fewer resources. They don't have access to credit. They're responsible often for food production, but don't own the land. They are unable, especially young girls, to engage in the activities that improve their lives with education, for example. They spend their time trying to find natural resources to survive, which means wood, searching for wood, searching for water, and engaging in long walks trying to get there and get back. So while the psychological component of the suffering here in already developed countries is severe, and I will say severe again, the feeling of doom is manifest in some children, and they speak about it. The physical toll that yields that psychological impact in developing countries is equally severe and is something that obviously must be tended to with the greatest urgency.
Thank you, Dr. Van Susteren. To follow up, could you please expand on how these effects can be exacerbated for vulnerable populations, especially young women and girls? That's the second part.
Yes, I incorporated that because it is especially the theme that we wanted to address today. But I will acknowledge that here in one thing I didn't talk about was that the many issues, the shortages of resources, et cetera, and then there are concurrent issues which are probably less pronounced, but it's the sense really, and Josh alluded to this, is that the center cannot hold the belief that the world will get better, that the world is listening. That is the core of a healthy emotional life. And right now, we can't believe that. If you look at those numbers, let's just talk about, well, the global survey and the US survey both show that about 8 out of 10, and by the way, I just learned recently that if you say 8 out of 10 people rather than a percentage, that has more impact on the hearer. So just a little tip. So I'm trying to switch from percentages to numbers, but 8 out of 10 people, young people, believe that that the world is on a very bad track. They're deeply worried, and they lay the blame almost, well, of course, on corporations, but almost predominantly right at the feet of government. So government leaders need to hear, and we need to hear it too, because we need to go to the policymakers and start making as much noise, as John Lewis said, make good trouble, necessary trouble, so that they can hear what it is that we are seeing in our research and our work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Van Susteren. That was a wonderful description. The description of the two-way street of how physical health affects our mental health and the other way around, and about kind of the mental health effects of seeing all of these statistics and seeing the world suffering through so many things that we've put it through. So thank you so much for that. And actually, we know that young women are disproportionately affected by these effects, but female data from cells to clinical trials in this topic makes up only about 5% of the medical research body. And I just want to share that actually as a team, we're going to be attending a hackathon at MIT in May on how we can use an AI-driven tool to promote the same topic as this event and focus on young women. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Burchnikiz. Dr. Burchnikiz is a neuroscientist with over 20 years of research and consulting experience in brain disorders and mental health. Her work focuses on how climate change and environmental factors impact brain health and how these insights can drive meaningful advancements in global health. In 2023, she launched EcoNeuro, a research initiative dedicated to the intersection of neuroscience and the environment. And the following year, she founded the International Neuroclimate Working Group, where she leads a network of over 100 scientists, clinicians, policymakers, and public health experts in advancing global research, advocacy, policy, and community response to the brain health impacts of climate change. Dr. Akiz, we'd like to hear from you in this round on the long-term and even transgenerational effects of climate change on children and youth neurological mental health, and how we can use evidence-based strategies to mitigate them. Firstly, could you please elaborate on the mechanisms through which these long-term and even transgenerational effects persist across years?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vildan, for your kind introduction and for having me here today. And thank you to my colleagues, the previous speakers, Marie, Josh, and Lisa. It's really wonderful to hear your insights, and you already said so much of what I have been thinking about, and so wonderful to have such colleagues, diverse colleagues, like really focusing on this topic. When I started become a neuroscientist and really started getting interested in brain health about 20 years ago. When we talked about brain health encompassing both neurological health, but also memory, cognition, and mental health, we always looked inward. We always looked at what's happening to our neurons, to our synapses, to our circuits. And but now with the growing evidence from my colleagues, we're understanding that just like Marie said, it's really impossible to have a healthy brain without a healthy body and without a healthy environment and a planet. We're all interconnected, and this is why now when we think about brain health and studying what's happening to our brains, especially for the vulnerable populations of children, of the elderly, with people with existing health conditions, it's really important to look at the environmental factors that are surrounding it, including climate change, including biodiversity loss, and so forth. So what do we know about in our studies in the group, the Neuroclimate Working Group? We have really great researchers that had started looking at the effects of air pollution, of heat, of malnutrition, extreme weather events on individuals that are even before they were born, when they were in the womb, in utero exposures, and what happened to their brains. And what we have seen is that this really, as Vildan had mentioned, transgenerational and long-term life effects from mothers who had gone through really traumatic, climate traumatic events such as Superstorm Sandy, the stress they went through, the heat, and being for the pregnant women, when they're exposed to heat, their bodies release a lot of inflammatory responses that pass through the placenta, pass through the children's brain, the infant fetus's blood-brain barrier, and those inflammatory responses cause further structural changes, sometimes epigenetic changes at the genetic level on children, and affect their brain development through a life course. One of the things we know, for example, is exposure to air pollution, exposure to heat, really stressful traumatic events such as wildfires, hurricanes. These terminate the pregnancies earlier, and children that are born prematurely, their brains, that last bit of the gestation is really critical for brain development. And so they have the children that are born more prematurely have more neurodevelopmental delays. We see at the school-age children much more risk of developing neurodevelopmental conditions such as autism and ADHD, similar to what Josh had mentioned. And later on in life, these same children have higher risk in young adolescent age and young adulthood, have mental health disorders as well. And so we see this lifelong effect on children, even from what happens while they were in utero. And one of the things we have to also, Lisa talked wonderfully about vulnerable communities, and my colleague, Frederica Pereira, she's a professor at Columbia University. She always says children bear the brunt, but children from the marginalized communities are the most affected. So that inequity aspect that is really important when we think about the impacts on vulnerable communities. And studies that had looked at extreme weather events that happen in mother's wombs and what happened to children's development afterwards had shown that the girls have a different brain structure that is, and that are getting more impacted and show more of the changes in their emotional growth and mental health later on, more than boys in these studies. So again, we see this vulnerability through just biologically in girls, but also there's a huge element, as Lisa mentioned, in terms of environmental and social, because they are more responsible from household duties. They get exposed to more air pollution from indoor air pollution from cooking gas and so on. That also affects their mental health and brain development as well. And I think I don't know, yeah. So these are some of the ways we know mechanistically what's happening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akiz, and a special thank you to you for joining us at 5:30 a.m. from California. That was a really wonderful first talk kind of about how women are especially affected by these transgenerational effects. So to follow up, what evidence-based strategies can we prioritize at both community and policy levels to kind of mitigate these lasting impacts?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vildan, for that question. I think it's really important. It was some kind of a personal journey for me too, to get out of the lab and realize to really make important change. We have to be speaking to people other than our ivory tower of scientists and academic journals and so on. And so I think one of the things we have to do is talk about it, raise awareness, to really think about this multidisciplinary conversations, and realizing that for change, we have to come together. We had, there was some talk about the climate anxiety from the studies and surveys that Lisa had mentioned and she had contributed to. We know, for example, we had recently a paper published with my colleague Josh Carlson, where we looked at the neurobiological basis of climate anxiety, for example, and found certain parts of the brain that is really gets activated for young people who are experiencing climate anxiety, different than general anxiety disorder and so on. And one of the things that we had found that was to me most striking was that when we looked at what works for what makes the anxiety go down, was collective action. Was pro-environmental behavior, but not at individual level, but in a collective level. So I think it's really our duty so the reason why I got into climate change was because I have 3 young children, and my oldest one had shown increased worry about the climate, and realizing that us, the older generations, we have the responsibility to show up, to utilize our expertise and networks and anything to be able to help young people feel more empowered to make a change. One of the things I always try to do in my speeches, in my talks, is when I talk about all these impacts of what's happening to the brain, such as our colleagues had done today, it becomes very depressing and very scary for a lot of people, not just young people, but for all of us. And one of the things that's really important to think about is our brains are incredibly plastic and they're very resilient. which means that if we can really, so like Mary had mentioned, if we can clean up our environment, if we can really work at the policy levels, we know, for example, the Clean Air Acts that had passed in China, that has passed in Mexico City, that has passed in the US in the last 20, 30 years. When we looked at, we can see already suicide rates going down drastically. We see improvement in the cognition of young people. We see increase in productivity and economic growth. There are some great studies from members of our group and others that really show these. So when we really act on making our planet more livable, when we increase access to green spaces, these have incredible co-benefits on our brain health and mental health as well. And it's really important to come together collectively and show and give the platform to young people and say, this is possible. There are so many ways you can make a change, and we see, and our bodies and nature and our brains are incredibly resilient. So if we clean it out, they will find a way to persevere again and regenerate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yildiz. And these are really meaningful and a lot of references, and definitely very useful for the audience. I believe that there would be, following this. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Gareth Morgan. Dr. Morgan is a chartered clinical psychologist and one of the clinical tutors on the university's clinical psychology training program. He works part-time as youth lead for the Climate Psychology Alliance and is co-chair of the Association of Clinical Psychologists Climate Action Network. He is deeply saddened, terrified, and angry about how the climate, ecological, and other planetary emergencies have escalated to the level they have reached. To this end, he values working with others to challenge the individualized Western approaches to psychology that speak of symptoms of mental illness in ways that obscure the relationship between human experience and wider socio-political context. We are living through a time of social and environmental collapse. Dr. Morgan believes the profession has huge potential for supporting us to process and adapt to our rapidly changing planet, and he is keen to support efforts to engage beyond the clinical room. Dr. Morgan, we'd like to hear from you as the youth lead for the Climate Psychology Alliance this round about the young people you work with who are deeply engaged in climate advocacy and often carry heavy emotional burdens related to the future of our planet, concerns about collapsing ecosystems, endangered species, and the well-being of future generations. From your perspective, how would you describe the current psychological state of these young people? What patterns or emotions do you commonly observe? Over to you, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you. Thank you. It's as I said, an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm glad this event is taking place, and lovely to meet lots of names that I've heard about, but not necessarily met and spoken with people here. I prepared some answers to this, but a lot of what I wanted to say has kind of already been said. So I'm kind of trying to scrap some of the things that I'd written down and rethinking about some of the things I want to say. And in answer to the question, yeah, young people are coming to us very distressed. There's despair, there's rage, there's a huge sense of guilt of people feeling that the responsibility is on them to take action. There's hopelessness. The whole spectrum of emotions. And I think that's one of the reasons why terms such as climate anxiety are problematic, because it's not just anxiety that people experience, it's a whole range of emotions. I think just reflecting on things that I might want to say that haven't been said, or perhaps haven't been said as much. I think for me, another thing is our terminology, our language. When we speak about climate anxiety, that's the problem. There's a risk then that this frames the anxiety as the problem. The problem is in the child, the problem's in the young person, and risks moving away from actually recognizing that actually this distress is caused by the failure of governments or big businesses to act. There's a danger we see the distress as something that needs to be reduced, needs to be addressed. I think even the terms mental health, mental health is a sort of relatively recent Western construct, which has resulted in us coming to experience particular aspects of human experience, particular feelings as symptoms, things to be eradicated, rather than actually as part of the range of human experience, that our emotions, our feelings, our lives are also not separate from the relationships and what's going on politically. You know, that phrase, the personal is political, is really important. Thinking again about language, you know, hearing sort of about how women and girls are sort of more vulnerable to the effects of climate crisis and distress. We need to be, I think, mindful of that vulnerability language as well. The problem isn't that women and girls are more vulnerable, but that patriarchal structures and inequality create barriers to resources that are going to support adaptation. We need to sort of think about how our language positions responsibility and risks sort of pathologizing somebody's feelings and risks sort of obscuring who's responsible for taking action. I really like the Lancet study's been mentioned a lot, so I won't kind of repeat those stats. And I'm noting what Lise said about 8 out of 10 rather than percentages. That's really good learning for me. I think another thing that's really good to point out, we've spoken about sort of the trauma effects that come from the direct impacts of the climate crisis, and I think it's been mentioned, but the idea of thinking about the climate crisis itself as a collective cultural trauma we're all going through is really important. So it's a collective culture. If we think of trauma as shattering our assumptions about our sense of safety and what it means to be in the world, then the climate crisis is a trauma that's impacting on us all, and we can start to make sense of lots of different reactions as trauma responses at individual and collective levels. So young people are living with threats to the future they hope to have, their aspirations for their career, their thoughts about having children all become threatened as they learn about the climate crisis. And Joshua spoke about the sort of betrayal that young people feel when they recognize that the adults who are meant to have their interests at heart haven't been taking the action they need to safeguard them. So then there's another sort of trauma threat there as well. Without in the Lancet study, nearly half of the children report feeling dismissed by adults when they speak about their feelings about the climate crisis. And without that validation, without having your emotions heard, this is something that comes up a lot in our work with young people. What children are left with is a sort of sense of alarmed aloneness, that they can't speak about this because it's going to be shut down. We can make sense of why adults are shutting it down in lots of different ways, but their feelings are shut down. So children either become overwhelmed, know where to go with the emotions, or they shut off, they distance themselves. So we see a lot of young people who seemingly, they don't come to us, they don't come to CPA, but seemingly don't care about what's going on. And if we think about this as a sort of cultural trauma, a lot of these young people are concerned, but they're kind of resorting to sort of nihilism and denial as a means of coping with that sort of feeling of disempowerment, that feeling of being powerless to do anything about what's going on in our world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan, for that description of how young people are feeling so many different emotions today. That was really wonderful talk, so thank you so much. So before the second round of questions, which we will have as more of a lightning round, it's time to hear some youth voices on the topic. So I'd like to invite Emin to share his screen with the youth video.
Hi everyone, my name is Nargiz Valiyeva. I'm from Baku, Azerbaijan. And today I want to take you all on a personal journey on how I realized that climate change is actually affecting me a lot, and not just by the words, but by actions. I lost my grandfather a couple of years ago. He unfortunately passed away, and the only thing that he left for us was his garden that he built with all of his might, with all of his heart, with all of his passion. His quote was that I want my grandchildren to enjoy this garden whenever I'm gone or whenever I'm not here. And that did happen. And As I realized that the birds were no longer chirping, the bees were no longer buzzing, the trees were no longer blooming, there was no nectar, there was no fruits in the trees for about a year now. And this made me realize that that's what climate change means. Climate change doesn't mean something broad or general. It can be something very specific and personal towards you. Another topic that I'm very interested in is mental health, how climate change can and will affect your mental health if you don't do anything about it. Whenever it's raining, whenever it's cloudy, you feel sad and depressed. You don't want to do anything. You just want to stay at home, just in a slump. My recommendation for the young people out there would be that there's really no recommendation. Everyone has their own passion. Just follow what your heart says. If your heart says that you should stop wasting water, why should you listen what Bob or John tell you? Just do what your heart tells you. There's no one fits rule book that fits everybody as a standard. No, you just do what you feel is correct and the right thing to do. Thank you.
My name is Nontuhuzelo Nikiwe, and I think one of the planetary crises that are especially creating for me mental health challenges, and especially in my community that I see, is around natural disasters. Great increase of natural disasters in the Southern African region, and especially here in my city, from one extreme of flooding to another of droughts, both affecting livelihoods, affecting food security, affecting sustainable living conditions. And so that's certainly the strain that I'm experiencing, and how I'm seeing the fact that climate specifically affects even our mental health and well-being. And so what we are doing is just creating spaces of knowledge building, capacity building, increasing the understanding of how climate change intersects with mental health, and how we can support people in our communities, how we can also ensure that we are well informed, creates better spaces or a greater understanding for us to respond effectively, but also to know that the power is actually in our hands. And so that's certainly one of the recommendations that I would make, is ensuring that our policies at a local government level, at a national government level, respond to the need for mental health well-being as an aspect of climate change responses or climate responses and climate policy, and also ensuring that that policy integrates well-being and just as much as it integrates infrastructure and climate financing.
Hi, my name is Nicole Muhire, and I'm from Kenya and Rwanda, and I have a few questions for you. Are you a clean girl with slick back hair and glowy skin? Or are you maybe part of the mob wife aesthetic with luxury bags and designer goods? Or are you maybe a trend follower with blueberry milk nails and participated in silk press season just because an influencer said so? I mean, the pressure to feel perfect and to look perfect is more than exhausting. It's toxic even. And it's not just hurting us, but it's hurting our planet. And the beauty and fast fashion industry feeds off this impossible standard and unreachable standard while fueling climate change, pollution, and exploitation. And that adds to the anxiety of wanting to feel good in your own skin and in your own style, but knowing the cost and impact it has on the earth. I personally have been experiencing a bit of anxiety and sometimes even feeling overwhelmed due to climate change, especially because of the heat waves and unstable weather that I've experienced while living in Europe. And to cope, I've been trying to find different ways to consume more intentionally, like thrifting if there's a piece I'd like to buy, or avoiding overbuying, and supporting ethical brands when I can, and just taking a break from social media and a break from the constant reminders that something is going wrong with the planet. But nobody should feel this pressure alone at all. So let's create safe spaces for young women to talk about it and to show that self-love and sustainability can go hand in hand.
Hi everyone, I'm Betul and I'm from Washington State. One planetary crisis that's affected my mental health is the loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity plays such a huge role in keeping ecosystems balanced, and I've noticed how much has changed just in my own area. There are fewer birds, bees, and native plants than I remember growing up, and it honestly makes me feel a mix of sadness and anxiety about where things are headed. To cope, I've tried to stay connected to nature, whether that's through volunteering, spending time outside in the trails, or learning more about how I can help locally. It doesn't fix everything, but it reminds me that small actions still matter. One thing I think we really need is more mental health resources that acknowledge how climate and environmental issues affect young people, especially women. We carry a lot of the stress, and having safe spaces to talk about it could make a big difference. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Nicole Vasilev. I'm here in the United States in Syracuse, New York, and I attend Syracuse University as a sophomore, studying international relations and environment sustainability and policy while minoring in French. And I'm here to answer some questions regarding planetary health and mental health and how they pair hand in hand. So the first question is, what is one specific planetary crisis that has affected your mental health? Well, here in Syracuse, my family has made it tradition to go to the mountains and ski. And it is one of my favorite activities where I can relax and de-stress during the winter season when there's a lot of grading happening, a lot of tests and exam prep, and it's always had a near and dear place in my heart. But as of recently, the season has been very sporadic and a lot of the lodges nearby have been closing a lot more frequently because there is no snow and there are no people, and it's a big expense. And that's a bit unfortunate for me because I don't get to enjoy the same thing as I once used to. While this is a small, minute problem, there are a lot of other more devastating issues that people are facing. So I'm very fortunate to say that that's the one thing that's currently heavily impacting me. But what are a few specific mental health consequences that this topic has had for me? Well, once again, the fact that I can't go out in nature and enjoy the snow as often as I used to is a little depressing, and honestly I have to find some kind of other alternative, and which I have found them, which is walking outside and enjoying the nature that I have. But that also means I have to take care of it, and that is what I would love to do and continue to do so throughout my life, so we can all enjoy this and hopefully slow the process of climate change. And then my last question here is, what would you recommend for continuing to emphasize mental health amidst the climate crisis? Well, the very first important concept we need to continue facilitating is education. For the younger generations, we need to tell them that this is happening, it is real, and what we need to do. We are the activists of our time, and we have to do this now. Just as we are doing with this initiative, we need to take care of our planet. Well, thank you, everyone, and see you soon. Be safe.
Thank you so much to everybody from Young Women for Planetary Health that contributed to that video. Before we start our second round, I'd just like to say that this will be a bit of a lightning round, just due to time constraints. So we'll ask all the questions as a whole and give each speaker about 2 or 3 minutes to respond. So if we could just keep it as concise as we can, thank you so much. I apologize just again due to time constraints. So I can hand it over to my co-moderator to announce the first question.
Thanks, Vildan. So for the second round of questions, we'll start with Dr. Wortzel. Dr. Wortzel, we'd now like to turn our focus this round to mental health impacts of rising temperatures. Firstly, could you explain that what thermodysregulation is and how increasing heat exposure affects emotional regulation and mental well-being, especially among vulnerable populations such as children and adolescents? Over to you.
Certainly. So thermodysregulation has in its word thermo, which is to do with temperature, and dysregulation meaning it's not able to kind of be controlled as minutely as we would like. And we know that people with mental illness have at baseline difficulties regulating their temperatures. We see this with depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And that the medicines that we prescribe to treat those illnesses can actually further impact temperature regulation detrimentally. So these people are more vulnerable in how their temperature is regulated and therefore are more susceptible to heat stress, heat stroke, things like that. But interestingly, there's epidemiology studies that show that there are higher rates of suicide and violence, and other types of crime during heat waves, so short fluctuations in temperature, as well as warmer times in the year in the spring and summer. And we're still trying to understand why that is. The mechanisms are unknown. Some of my research is trying to look at things like how heat impacts sleep, which may impact mental health, or how cognition is negatively impacted by higher temperatures and physical activity as well. I'm trying to remember the second part of your question. I apologize. I'm so sleep deprived. Tell me what it was again what was the second piece that you wanted?
If you could talk about kind of the recommendations that you would have for any people that are being affected by this, especially young women.
Certainly. So when it comes to recommendations, we still are in our infancy of knowing and how to advise people about their medications. At this point, we're not suggesting anyone should change their medication regimen, but that they should talk with their doctors so that they're aware how medicines may make them more vulnerable. People should have access to climate-controlled settings so that in the wake of a heat wave, they have a way of cooling. Some of the lay recommendations that we've given in the past, like going to a cooling center, may not be as effective as we once thought. It's important to try to have sustained cooling. So ideally, people should have access to air conditioning. We need to think about how we're building buildings to make sure that they're insulated better. But these are larger systemic issues. Other things that people can do in the moment is check up on people who may be more vulnerable, the unhoused individuals, older relatives who may not necessarily be as cognizant of what's happening with temperature. So I think young people are going to be stewards of older generations as well as they're struggling with temperature insults.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wortzel, for explaining that really interesting concept of thermodysregulation and the special effects it can have on young women and vulnerable populations. So now I'd like to ask our second question to Dr. Van Susteren. So Dr. Van Susteren, what do you think our biggest takeaway from this event should be, and what should we focus on regarding the future?
Thank you very much for that question, because it's dear to my heart. So Josh has pretty much outlined the general concepts. I won't repeat them. And in the interest of time, I'd like to start this 2-minute oration with the statement that what we need to do is turn what we already know into what we do. I think it was Gareth, or maybe it was Burson, who said, talking to our colleagues is certainly our safe place, but now we have to charge ourselves with going to places where we are not so very comfortable. And that is to take what we already know, all the research, and the research, as somebody once said to me, doing more research, and I did do more research nonetheless, is like rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic to get a better view. We've already got everything we know. Now we've got to get it to the policymakers. That is our charge, to go to places we don't anticipate going and where we don't necessarily feel comfortable. And I will add, from having worked with children both in court and interpersonally in my office, that when a young person talks about the damage from climate disruption, you can hear a pin drop. We know they have the moral high ground. They're at the tip of the spear. It is incumbent upon us now, collectively, and as Burson said, this is the magic sauce to make ourselves feel better, is to be together, reaching policymakers where they are making decisions. So that's my overview takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Susteren. Now I'd like to ask our second question to Dr. Ickes. Dr. Ickes, I mean, as Dr. Van Susteren mentioned about a lot about policy issues and all these things, we'd like to focus on now on air pollution and adverse brain health outcomes. Firstly, could you expand on the link between air pollution and adverse brain health outcomes, such as heightened risk of anxiety, depression, and even stroke, particularly in developing brains? To follow up, how do these risks compound for vulnerable populations like children, young women, and youth in low-resource settings? Over to you, Dr. Ickes.
Sure. Thank you so much. So when we talk about air pollution, the pollutants in the air enter our brain through two pathways. One is more direct pathway through the olfactory bulb every time we inhale directly to the brain, and the other one is through the systemic inflammation. When we breathe polluted air, it causes inflammation in our lungs, in other bodily systems, and those inflammatory responses get into our blood, which then goes through our bodies, including our brains, and those inflammatory responses sometimes pass through the blood-brain barrier. For vulnerable populations such as children, such as people who have existing health conditions, sometimes this blood-brain barrier is more permeable, allowing more pollutants to enter. When we talked about, Josh talked about the heat makes the blood-brain barrier again more permeable, allowing more inflammatory responses or pollutants to enter the brain. And what we see happens when we are exposed to air pollution, like you have mentioned, on the aging population, we see higher risk of stroke. Alzheimer's disease is considered one of the biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and other forms of dementia. In the young people, it is associated with the higher risk of developing anxiety, depression. Suicide rate goes really high up. There's some studies that show within a day or two of having really polluted air, we see suicide risks going much higher. And again, that intergenerational impacts that the children at their mother's womb that are exposed to air pollution have actual structural changes in their brains that then that they can see through when they're born through fMRI studies, and these children have higher risk of developing neurodevelopmental disorders and mental health conditions later in life. And one of the things I want to go back to Lise's point, and sorry, I was calling you Lisa, I apologize, it's Lise, is that policy, how important policy actions is. I was fortunate enough to speak at a couple high-level meetings. One was World Health Organization's Global Conference on Air Pollution and Health, and the other one was United Nations is having a big thematic dialogue around non-communicable diseases and mental health this September. And they had a lot of dialogues with representatives from different parts of the world, really emphasizing how important it is to act on air pollution. And we know that when we clean our airs, we really see dramatic effects on the health of individuals, but that also includes our brain health and mental health. And going back to really children's vulnerabilities, they are really the most vulnerable groups because of their developing lungs, because of their developing brains, because of their higher breathing rates to air pollution. So it's really important to emphasize in that global conference I was at, there was a mother who had lost their children to it was the first and only cause of death was air pollution. This happened in London too, because their children had some chronic had some lung conditions that was affected. And it's really, when you hear her story, when you see the pictures of that child, I think that's the most effective way. It's impossible not to act on it, and such a simple way, because by clean air, we know those regulations of Clean Air Acts work. So it's really important to emphasize how it needs to be really adopted worldwide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ikiz. It was really amazing to hear about all the effects that air pollution can have on our brains. So thank you so much for that talk. Now I'd like to ask our second question to Dr. Morgan. So Dr. Morgan, firstly, what kinds of support or interventions do you believe are most urgently needed to help youth cope and remain helpful in the face of such overwhelming challenges? And what practical steps can both practitioners and everyday individuals take to promote well-being and foster effective action in response to the climate crisis? Again, please keep it to 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah. Try and be quick. I think one thing we don't need necessarily, pardon me, is a scaling up of mental health services. Certainly not the sort of Western mental health services. I think whilst one-to-one therapy can be and is useful for a lot of people, there's a danger, I think, that if we again see the scaling up of mental health services as the solution, the problem becomes the child with climate anxiety rather than the systemic change needed, and it risks further alienating children and young people who will already be feeling alienated. I think, as Vildan was saying earlier about the importance of action, connecting with other people is something that young people always tell us is really, really powerful for them. Sort of being present with other people who are taking action is really important. Trying to find ways that we can offer groups that help people to normalize and validate their experiences, validate their emotions, help them to practice self-care as well. Often people can kind of get into the activist space or into environmental space and feel like I've got to be taking action all the time. So helping people to take a break and recognizing that we all need a bit of denial. We all need to look after ourselves in these spaces. Already been mentioned the importance of acting. I mean, that's really, really crucial, is that we need to be, children and young people are gaslit. They're told they're the future. They're going to solve the climate crisis. And we might be educating and teaching about recycling, things, very low impact. And they are going to feel betrayed when they grow up and realize the sort of systemic nature of the threats and what needs to happen. So we need them to see us acting, and we need to be letting them know about the people that are taking action. We crucially need to also be attending to and validating their emotions in all of the teaching we do around the climate crisis. When a child presents to us as distressed or gives us a worry, there can be a temptation in us as adults to kind of go straight to problem solving. And one of the things we need to do as adults is be aware of our own defenses, our own threat responses, find ways to be present for the child and validate their emotion, allow that emotion to be heard, to be validated without jumping to solutions. Finally, I think we need to be working to develop community cohesion and adaptation. A lot of what's going to be, a lot of the effects of the climate crisis are locked in. We're going to see increasing difficulties, and we need to be thinking about educating our children. A lot in the UK context, a lot of education is not suited to educating children for the world they're going to be living in. So we need to be giving them the skills and working with communities to support adaptation and thinking about different practices, unlearning a lot of what we know about psychology, thinking about sort of indigenous wisdom that doesn't make the separation between the human and the more than human world, but does think about our experience as relational, I think is going to be really, really important.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. Really, we need to develop a community of practice, community of, young people can really act upon all these, issues that we have discussed. And now I'd like to extend the thanks to all of our distinguished speakers. And this is the part when we'd like to open the Q&A session. Does anybody have any questions for our speakers?
If any of the Zoom participants have any questions, please put them in the chat. And for our participants on YouTube, please go ahead and put them into the comments so we can copy and paste them into here as well. Okay, if nobody has any questions they'd like to ask at this time, please feel free to put them in the chat later. But now I'm honored to introduce Dr. Osman Mushtaq for the closing remarks of this event. So Dr. Mushtaq is the Deputy Minister of Health in the Norwegian government. He was a member of the Board of Trustees for the EAT Forum, an organization focused on transforming the global food system. And he also has a strong background in both medicine and economics. He completed a Doctor of Medicine degree at the University of Oslo, as well as a Bachelor of Applied Science and Economics from the University of Oslo. His diverse experience in healthcare, economics, and public service has contributed to his current role in shaping health policy at the national level in Norway. Dr. Mushtaq, I would now like to hand over to you for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Vildan. Can you hear me clearly? Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much also for the invitation. It's great to take a little break in the scheduling and be able to come here and spend these short few moments with you. Thank you so much for organizing this event. I've seen the agenda, and it seems like you have had a very interesting conversation around the nexus between environmental and climate and health, and this is also actually was the starting point of my engagement in public health and climate issues, and also my political engagement started from this route. This is obviously many years ago. However, I got introduced to the notion of how public health is intrinsically linked with the climate change and the fact that it is one of the biggest threats to public health. But when I was a young student and we were talking about this was often seen as something abstract. Over the past decade, we've received a lot more knowledge, and we know a lot more in terms of how first of all, how the healthcare sector can make sure that we mitigate the impact of climate change, and secondly, how we can also adapt to a changing environment. And I can say, from a Norwegian perspective, obviously, we're in a place where the effects of climate change is, also severe. However, we have the means to make sure that we adapt to them. And our biggest challenge is to make sure that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I've seen that you've also tackled the issue around how these major kind of drivers of environmental change also connects with mental health, and I want to actually take a little step back and talk about some of the experiences that we received during the pandemic. And that's a great example because pandemics are we're looking at them as through the lens that environmental degradation is going to make sure that the opportunity or the likelihood of zoonosis are going to increase. So zoonosis means when pathogens move from animals to humans, and that creates new disease. And COVID-19 pandemic was a result of that. And the possibility of transmission of infectious disease from animals to human population is increasing because of environmental degradation and because of climate change. And this is like kind of a very direct link that we are seeing. So a virus found in animals and that spread globally among people illustrate that in nature under pressure increases the likelihood of also threats that are different than just the environmental disasters that we see. And disease can spread very easily and have high mortality. And what we saw during the pandemic is if you implement public health measures against this disease, that can also have a very strong backside. And very forceful interventions might affect mental health negatively. In the Nordic countries, we can illustrate this. I was working in Pakistan actually during the pandemic time, and we saw the same, that it had a very, very negative effect on young people because the measures were invasive. We in Norway had more invasive measures than in Sweden, and in many other countries, you close down schools for many months at a time. And what the figure has shown is that, for instance, in the Norwegian context, Norwegian adolescents who experienced COVID restriction to a larger extent have reported more mental unhealth than their Swedish counterparts. So that's like a very interesting, comparative study. But we know from low and middle income countries is that a lot of the kids that were placed out of school, for instance, from COVID-19 restrictions, they never returned back to school. So, however, it's important for me to point out that our experts have not established a causal link between these two, but I think the example underscores that we need to have a broad approach when we consider desirable and undesirable effects of public health measures when it comes to future pandemics that are more likely because of environmental pressures. So I think it's important for us. We have learned a major lesson that we need to focus on mental health aspects during health emergencies and our response to them, and how we make sure that the health and benefit of young people are codified in also our law when we are responding to health emergencies. And as you know, in Europe, we have a major war in Ukraine, and crisis is one of the things that we are also planning for. So there are also the impacts of what type of interventions we end up doing plays a big role. So as I think the contributors are before me illustrated in their interventions, that there are multiple paths leading from degeneration of the environment, warmer climate, to human unhealth, including mental health. And young people are particularly vulnerable to mental stress, as they have less experience than adults to build upon. And we all therefore should keep in mind that we have to make preparedness plans for the next health crisis, whatever it is, caused by a zoonosis or heat waves or droughts or flooding, and consider the efforts on health from both crisis in itself, but also how we implement our measures, and how that can lead to decrease in mental health of our populations. So I'm actually, one of my kind of main work right now is to make sure that we update our laws in Norway, to kind of, after learning from the COVID-19 pandemic, but then also embracing the fact that we live in a world which is getting more unpredictable, and how we make sure that we have youth's mental health as a very vital part of that work is quite important for us. And that's why I'm so glad that you're kind of raising this issue, because for me, I see the very direct linkages. So thank you so much. And also for the other organizers and the people that have participated. It's an honor for me to have been here and giving these closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mushtaq. That was an amazing session of closing remarks to finish us off. Thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. I just want to open up the floor one last time to anybody that has any questions. So I'll wait a few seconds if anybody wants to put their question in the chat. I believe somebody has asked in the chat. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to ask a personal question. What advice would you give young people who want to become good advocates for environmental and planetary health and public health? How should we improve ourselves? What would be wonderful? Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. And that was a great question. Is your name Numan?
Yes.
Yes, that was an excellent question. And frankly speaking, I think just the fact that you've chosen to spend your time listening into this this session, it sounds like it's a great start. Look, I'm going to tell you what I did. So when I was a medical student, I didn't know anything about public health issues or climate health issues. I was just going to study medicine and become a doctor. That was what I was thinking. However, I managed to get in touch with, because a little bit of interest with organizations that were working on these issues, and managed to educate myself on these issues, so I could actually be an effective advocate for these issues in many different forums. It was like at the local level with the local government. It was at the national level with the national government. And also internationally, participated in multiple climate change meetings, etc. And it was so good, because when you see a nexus of where you can actually end up learning new things, and at the same time that you can contribute with your youth and with the experience that you're coming from, that I think makes for the best engagement. So I think you have to find the topics that you think are interesting to you, and make sure that you find a group of people that also find these topics of being interest, and then make sure that you balance off learning with also doing, and advocacy is really interesting. I mean, it can be at the city level, it can be at the national level, and it can be internationally. And I would say, make sure that you don't lose the touch from what's going on the ground as well. For me, that was very important, because if you just talk about the multilateral work, like what's happening with the climate change negotiations, or like at the international level with the World Health Organizations, etc., you can end up losing the stuff that is happening on the ground. So it's good to be able to kind of see the whole kind of levels of work in this. So start small with the stuff that you like, with the people that you think are into the same things, and then build from there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mushtaq, and thank you for that question. Does anybody else have any question that they want to ask before we kind of wrap up the event? Okay, if not, before we end, I can just read out some memorable quotes from our speakers that we can all take with us. So first of all, one of the impactful things that Dr. Studer said in her opening remarks was that the signs are showing us that the planetary health crisis is happening, and so are our hearts and minds. And she also said that the health of the land and peoples are synonymous. Dr. Wortzel told us that when we think about climate change, there are many factors that we have to think about: heat, pollutants, frustration with the government for inaction, connecting and coping with our peers and communities. Dr. Van Susteren, she told us that every physical impact of the environment and nature has an effect on our mental health, and this in turn has an effect back on our physical health. So it is a two-way street that we have to deal with. In addition to that, Dr. Ike has told us that when we think about brains and neurological health, we always look inward, so neurons, synapses, but now we're understanding that it's also important to look outwards, and it's impossible to have a healthy mind without a healthy body and a healthy planet. Dr. Morgan told us that now young people are living with threats to the future that they hope to have, threats to their aspirations, their dreams, and young people are often dismissed when they talk about climate change. So we must look to that when looking to the future and helping and empowering young people. And Dr. Van Susteren also said that one of the key takeaways is what we need to do is now turn what we already know into what we do and go to places where we're not comfy to act and go to policymakers and get this into legislation and acts right now. And lastly, Dr. Mushtaq told us that as young people, we should look to spaces where we can learn new things and also contribute. So this could be international spaces, national spaces, focus on the topics that you find interesting. So that was it for our event today. Before we leave, we can take a quick screenshot just to commemorate this wonderful occasion. A big, big thank you for all of our wonderful speakers, all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time today. If everybody who can could open their cameras, we can take a quick screenshot before we leave today. I'll wait a few seconds. All right, 3, 2, 1. A big thank you again to all of our speakers and to my wonderful co-moderator, Shaikat. Thank you all so much. It was such a wonderful event. Looking forward to continuing with this topic in the future and forging a better planet for all of us and better mental health for youth and for young women. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Vildan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Take good care. Be well.
You as well, Dr.